One of them is the main girl who just inherited this farmhouse from her dead parents, and she plans on burning it to the ground because you know how the girlies be with the mommy and daddy issues. This is a totally new background because the couch directly across from me that you're used to seeing me on has direct sunlight on top of it because I don't have curtains in my living room because apparently I'm like the dumb white girl on that stalker Netflix show called You. So welcome to my dresser instead, which is arguably the second most expensive thing that I bought for my apartment besides the couch. Maybe one day I'll do an apartment tour, but for this video, I'm going to talk about the 10 books that I have read recently. Reading books has pretty much been the one consistent thing going on in my life recently. I would say the only other consistent thing would be wearing bras and underwear from Parade, which is the sponsor of today's video. They are pretty much all the undergarments I own right now because they're always very comfortable. They have so many different styles for me to choose from, and they always have a good deal. So something that you might have noticed if you have been watching my channel for a while is that I have gained some weight, and as a result, I've needed to buy new underwear with a wider waistband and a new bra. So I'm going to show you some of the bras that I got to adapt to this new weight change. So my everyday one, or when I go to the gym, is gonna be this Scoop bralette in black. I just wanted something super simple and neutral and stretchy. And then the fun one that I got is this sheer sculpt pop out triangle bralette. It's in a nice silky mesh material, and I'm going to a brat themed drag show later. So I thought the green was super fun. If you want to try it out, you can use my code Cindy40 to get 40% off of items site-wide. The link will be at yourparade.com/Cindy40. All right, now let's dive into the books I read recently, starting off with a strong one that was a very pleasant surprise, and it's called Antibot. This is a book that focuses on the relationship between a female robot and her human owner. I think already from saying female robot, you know where this is going. She is literally designed to be the perfect girlfriend. She makes dinner for him every night. She wears sexy outfits for him that he orders specifically for her closet. She satisfies his physical and emotional needs. The entire novel is from her point of view, and you get to see the transition from her whole entire life basically revolving around serving this man and trying to make him happy, but beginning to exhibit more human traits like curiosity and having secrets and longing for something more than this. I kind of expected it to be like a generic Black Mirror episode. Like, this concept isn't really anything new, but it pleasantly surprised me because of how much I could really see myself and my former relationship with this robot. It was such a fascinating character study about what it means to be a woman, because I did not expect the way that she held so much stress and anxiety over pleasing this guy that had all of these expectations for her to be a sexy girlfriend, but also a therapist, but also a mother, but also a servant, like all of these things. It's weird because technically she is a robot, but like if she were a human, this would be a completely abusive relationship. And I just saw so many of the dynamics and emotional turmoil that she was going through to be similar to my relationship with my ex-boyfriend, where at the time I felt like I was lacking a sense of identity. Anytime I showed like a human side of myself where I was sad about something or upset about something that he did, similar to like what the main character was going through, she would receive so much criticism for showing any sign of humanity, along with like the constant fear of displeasing him in any way, trying to please a shitty man. And I was just so surprised at how much I empathized with this robot. It was really interesting to see the parallels of this robot who doesn't have autonomy or control over her own life because she's expected to serve a man the entire time, actually being very similar to the expectations of young women in real life. I was like, oh my god, is being a woman just having a lack of autonomy? Is that what it means to be a woman? That Billie Eilish song from the Barbie movie was definitely playing in my head while I was reading this book. If you were ever a straight girl who was in the trenches between the ages of 18 to 24 with a bad relationship, like, I do think you would read this book and be able to empathize with the main character as much as I did. The next book that I read was actually a reread, and that is Severance, which is a dystopian novel about an Asian woman who works in Manhattan, and she's used to the monotony of her work routine. And even when a pandemic strikes the world where literally people are becoming sick with this disease disease that originated from China and people have had to leave the city because they're all dying, she is still trying to go through her routine and be basically like a worker drone. I first read this before COVID-19 and I decided to reread it because it was chosen for one of the book clubs that I'm in, and I thought it'd be interesting to reread it now that I am an Asian woman who lives in New York and I have experienced COVID-19 myself. But I did feel like my impressions of the book were pretty much the same as when I first read it. I like that this form of this zombie apocalypse is like a non-violent depiction of a monotonous routine under capitalism. Like, it's a very direct critique of the way that we are like zombies just from working every day without really having any lives of our own. So people who are affected by Shen fever in this book are essentially zombies who are just doing the same thing over and over again until they die. Overall, I did feel pretty lukewarm about the book. I think the ending was pretty rushed and I didn't feel quite satisfied with how it ended. But I think there's a lot to be said about hustle culture and solitude, and I like the idea of it being connected to a pandemic and mirroring the ways that capitalism and consumerism affects us. Because I think part of what COVID-19 forced us to think about is who we really are when we don't have capitalism and consumerism. Like, how do we form our identity and self-worth when we don't have these things? The next book that I read is a memoir called Sociopath, and it's about the author's struggle to come to terms with her diagnosis of being a sociopath and how that really shed light on the way that she grew up and how she felt different from other people. She would also become a psychologist herself, and that was a way of her filling in the gaps of what she felt like was lacking from formal diagnoses. So I wanted to see from someone's perspective what it's like to not feel other emotions the way that other people do, like guilt or empathy or fear. And there is an interesting dynamic with the way that not only did she feel nothing, but how she didn't like that feeling of nothingness. And because she didn't like that feeling, she was constantly trying to replace that nothingness with something. So she would do things like steal or lie. She would learn how to pick locks and invade homes. And what intrigued me about picking up this book is how the summary mentioned that she does find love along the way, because I was curious about what it's like for sociopaths to be in loving relationships. But there's a few things that I felt were lacking from this book. It turns out that the relationship was someone who was way older, like an adult, that she met when she was 14. And then later she reconnects with. It's never mentioned at any point why it was weird for this grown man to form a close, intimate relationship with a 14-year-old girl. I was like, girlie, you were a victim. She's also incredibly privileged too, because she has a dad who is like the owner of this big company in the music field, and so that was why she was able to be easily employed and get through life. Like, of course, because you're a nepo baby, things are gonna be a lot easier for you than anyone else who has a disorder but doesn't have the luxury of being wealthy. I feel like there was a lack of self-awareness for that aspect as well. Some of the details in the events that she was sharing almost kind of felt like it was too neatly packaged. There is a degree of authenticity that I get a sense for when I read a really good memoir. And for this one, a lot of the ways that she framed specific conversations and events made me question how real it actually was. The fact that so many scenes are just so perfectly timed, and then the very last moment of the book, it really is like some kind of last episode finale of a TV show kind of thing. Again, it makes me wonder what really happened, because it just feels too perfectly packaged. And then throughout the book, when she talks about constantly lying, then it makes me think, wait, are you lying in some parts of the book too? But then I don't know if me wondering that is just me holding a higher standard to this book or having some kind of discrimination against it because of her sociopathy. Like, maybe I'm just unfairly putting my standards of people who don't have sociopaths, like with the books that I've read from them, and I'm applying it to her, and maybe I need to look at it through a different lens because maybe she just thinks differently or operates differently, and that's why her book just doesn't hit the same for me. I don't know. But someone did reach out to me who saw that I had mixed feelings about the book as well, and she also had mixed feelings, and when I told her why, she said that she felt the exact same way with the types of questions that she was wondering herself. So if you have read the book, I am curious what you think about it, because I definitely have mixed feelings. The next book that I read is Natural Beauty. This is about an immigrant daughter who is a piano prodigy who actually learned piano from her parents, but unfortunately unfortunately, there's an accident that leaves her parents debilitated, and as a result, she has to give up her career and instead find a more stable job. In this case, it ends up being a high-end beauty and wellness store in New York City. The way that the store is described is almost like a cult. It's kind of like Gwyneth Paltrow with her whole Goop franchise. The book goes into a lot of detail about the different products and procedures that they have. There are some products that will suck out cheap Botox for you. There's some eyelash extensions that are made out of spider silk. Like, a lot of it is very cutting edge, innovative technology in the beauty industry. And because she now has a job in the industry, she is handed these products that slim her thighs and smoothen her skin and lighten her hair. It is more about Western beauty standards and about how with these products, essentially she is assimilating into this ideal version of a beautiful westernized woman. And because this is a surrealist horror book, it definitely escalates to more gross kind of body horror. But I actually find what connected me the most to this story was this sense of duty that the main character has for her immigrant parents. I do not relate to that personally, but I found that to be incredibly sympathetic. I'm finding that it's hard for me to get into surrealist horror because if the book starts to get too weird for me, it kind of loses me. But hopefully with the way that I'm describing it, like if it sounds like it's up your alley, then you should check it out. The next book that I read is Blood Orange. This is probably like the quickest I've ever read a book because it's a very short poetry collection by a trans Muslim displaced indigenous Palestinian. A lot of the themes are about yearning for home and belonging and mental health and queerness, and especially what it means to be trans. There's just so many intersections of marginalization that the author is going through, but at the same time, they really want this ideal home life that they're not able to get because they are so heavily displaced. When it comes to Palestinian poetry, I personally enjoyed other collections more, but I still thought this was a quick read. I did still highlight a couple of things that I felt were resonant, so I will read them out loud to you. Being in the diaspora is having genocide at your door and you're not home to greet it. Being in the diaspora is wondering which cut from your paycheck killed your cousin. Being in the diaspora is being told you are not from anywhere while they kill you everywhere. Being in the diaspora is being murdered without ever bleeding. I feel like this must be so especially relevant today as we are going through US elections. I think a lot of people are being pressured to vote between these two parties, and I feel so much sympathy for Palestinians living in America who feel like whatever they're paying for taxes, whichever party they're voting for, their family and their ancestors are still being killed. It's such an unfair system to be in for them. So I think this type of poem especially resonates because of that. I stand with Palestine, Armenia, indigenous folks everywhere. Does not feel adequate. It's a standing when I have voted for people who killed my family. It's a standing when I go to a single protest while you are carpet bombed with phosphor. It's a standing when I realize politics is not made for someone like me and I am next. It's a standing when I am a settler. Basically, the poetry collection is full of a lot of feelings of anger and frustration and helplessness, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of like resilience and refusing to give up. Again, it's so short, so you might as well just check it out. The next book that I read is To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods. This is the first book of a fantasy series about a girl who has power to literally pull life out of bodies and kill them. The other main character of this book is the enemy prince whose people are colonizing her people, and when he discovers her gift, he offers her a deal to become his private assassin and eliminate his political rivals for him. He says if she does this, it will be for the good of both of their worlds and it will be a win-win because it's going to protect her people from being harmed, and he will make sure to specifically look out for her family and make sure that they never starve or suffer harm again. He's obviously a very shady fellow, but because she's so desperate to protect her family and feels like she has nothing else, she agrees to it. This book has some controversy when it was coming out for two different parts. Some people were saying that this felt like a colonizer romance because she does develop feelings for the guy who is literally using her to enact genocide. And so the fact that she would fall for him and go along with it is making people side-eye her and be like, girl, what the fuck are you doing? The other controversy that happened was what sounded like some personal beef going on with the author and another author that really just blew out of proportion by being publicized. Basically, she had been one of the authors that were targeted by Chlorine, who was an author that would create anonymous Goodreads accounts to leave 1-star ratings to all of these other debut authors that she saw as a threat. Molly has continued to avoid Goodreads, which I think is a good practice for a lot of authors, but she does have a friend who checks her Goodreads for her just to make sure that another Kate Chlorine doesn't pop up. And apparently this friend started noticing some suspicious behavior from this one individual account, because that account not only would leave bad reviews about her book, totally fine and normal. I think part of the criticism is that they felt like it was a colonizer romance, which I think is a valid viewpoint to have if you took that away from the book. I mean, I think differently, and I'll talk about that later, but I can understand why people would feel that way. But what was strange about this particular account was that they were keeping up with other reviews, and they would get into very long-winded arguments for people who left either positive or neutral reviews about the book. Molly's friend started being suspicious of this account because it's one thing to not like the book, but it's another thing to feel so passionately about it that you would keep track of what other people were saying about it and argue with other people who either feel neutral or positive about the book and try to get them to remove the review, as they turn out to be the sister of another author who used to be friends with Molly. Those two had a falling out a while ago. I don't know why they fell out. So the friend put two and two together, and it definitely seemed like a conflict of interest. They ended up reaching out to the sister, and that freaked out the sister. So the sister made a post about how Molly was intruding upon readers' spaces by keeping track of these negative reviews, and that Molly was doxing reviewers who didn't like her book. While I do think there is a valid concern with authors being in reviewers' spaces, doxing is a very loaded term. Like, that basically means that you found this person's address or contact information and you're gonna leak it to the public with very nefarious intentions. It really just escalated into this huge thing where people then began to turn against Molly and view her as someone who was literally doxing anyone who spoke negatively about her book. And then that blew up into a bigger thing where Chinese nationalists started harassing her and sending her death threats. It was just a messy situation all around. And that's why for a while I didn't know if I would read the book, because it just seemed like it had so much baggage with it. One night I ended up getting high, and because I was feeling loosey-goosey, I was like, you know what, let me read this book after all and see what my viewpoint is about it. And what's funny is that because I was high when I started the book, I started sending voice notes to the author herself. Now keep in mind, despite us having the same agent, we weren't really people who had talked to each other before. But again, I was feeling loosey-goosey. So I was sending voice notes to her and being like, hey girl, sorry about the doxing accusations and you being threatened for your life and all, but I just gotta say, your main girly is a dumb bitch, because this guy is shady as fuck. And not only that, throughout the book, he will drop in lines that are of her language to show that he's fluent in her language. And I was sending voice notes to Molly saying, you know what this guy reminds me of? He reminds me of those white guys that go to China or some Asian country and film themselves ordering something, and they're trying to get a reaction out of the grandma so that the grandma can be like, oh my god, you speak so fluently. So I was just making fun of this dude the whole time. I just really appreciate that Molly was such a good sport about me being high out of my ass and being like, yo, what the fuck is with these characters? So what I have concluded from this is that rather than avoiding another author due to conflicts of interest, I should actually embrace this by sending voice notes to her while I'm high and making fun of her characters, because that is definitely a way more enjoyable experience for me than arguing with other people whether it's a colonizer romance or not. Okay, my camera died, so I'm popping in from the evening. Sorry this video is so all over the place. But overall, in terms of the criticisms, I personally didn't feel like it was a colonizer romance, but that was just because I felt like it was super obvious the main guy was so icky in the first place and that he wasn't gonna be the actual love interest. I can understand why people felt that way because of the sensitive nature of some of the events in the book. Like, a lot of this was inspired by Unit 731, which is what the author talks about in her author's note. If you don't know what Unit 731 is, it was basically this biological and chemical warfare research that was done by the Japanese. It experimented on thousands of Chinese citizens and wiped them out. But I think when the author is own voices and when their own family has been affected by it, it makes me more willing to see how they decide to approach their cultural identity and history through art. I feel like asking whether this is a colonizer romance is a bit too simple of a question. I feel like the more interesting question would be, how much leeway does a person have to write a colonizer romance if they are part of the group that was being colonized in the first place? Because I made a video a long while ago talking about this trend of romance books where it showcases enemies to lovers, where one side is the oppressor and the other side is the oppressed group. And almost always in these romances, the author of these books are people that belong to the colonizer group. Nobody blinks an eye when white authors do this, and yet there is so much scrutiny scrutiny for an author of color for writing something that the implications of it being a romantic thing in the first place has drawn controversy in itself, to the point where she is being accused of having a horrible character and getting death threats for all of those things. It just feels like there are higher standards placed upon authors of color if they don't do it perfectly in readers' eyes. I'm someone with the belief that anybody can write about anything, but especially if they are writing about their own cultural history and they're exploring whatever needs to be explored through their art, to me, I think they have full leeway to explore it however they want to explore. But I kind of feel like some people have a strict set of requirements to fulfill. So it's like, if you're taking that risk of tackling something that is sensitive but important to you, but you don't execute it well in the reader's eyes, whether the writing or the world building or whatever is not good enough to the reader, then you're going to be seen as part of the problem. When you take risks or you try something that is sensitive or different or whatever, it might not work, but like, I don't think you should get death threats for that, you know what I mean? I think it's good to have stories that encourage discourse and healthy conversations, and to have stories with different interpretations. Like, a story that makes people argue whether it's a colonizer romance or not, to me, shows how a piece of media can be very subjective, and I feel like it's okay to have a book with different interpretations like that, as long as people don't set death threats to each other or like harass other people for having different opinions. But the only thing I really can't defend is, apparently the author was marketing this book as if it were enemies to romance, and maybe that was like supposed to be the twist, that it was actually going to be enemies to lovers to enemies. But I think perhaps that marketing push or angle or whatever had misled people, and maybe that's why people are angry about it. She did compare it to Zutara, and Molly, girl, if you're watching, that shit was not Zutara at all. But yeah, I feel like the guy in the book was just so obviously a bad dude, and I really hope he gets his ass kicked in book 2, which apparently is going to be titled To Kill a Monstrous Prince or something along those lines. If that makes it any more obvious that he's not a good dude, I don't know what will. Anyway, the next book that I read is Disability Visibility. This is an anthology written by several different writers who have different disabilities. I really enjoyed this because the anthology covered so many different topics. I felt like I learned so much from it, including things that I hadn't even considered before because of my own limited experiences. Like, there were discussions about infanticide. Actually, that was the first story in the book. It's called Unspeakable Conversations. This was my favorite essay from the entire book, but I think you can also find it online. This was written by a disabled author who had to debate with a philosophy professor about whether she deserved the right to live or not. Future Cindy popping in because when I was editing this video, I felt like the way that I was describing the debate wasn't doing it justice. Basically, the philosophy professor strongly believes that all disabled people, including the author herself, would be better off if they had not been born at all. So he believes that her parents, or just parents of disabled children in general, should be given the option to kill the child so that way those children can avoid future suffering. Keep in mind, we're not talking about abortion here where the baby's not even born yet. We're talking about literally the baby has been born and we should kill the baby because they are disabled and they would be better off being dead. It shows how disabled people can almost be seen as not actually a full-fledged person. And the gag is, the professor that was arguing about this is totally all for animal rights. He's a vegan. He doesn't believe in eating meat, which I think is a noble philosophy to have. But then there's like this weird disconnect that he has with disabled people. And they talk about this in the debate as well, because the disabled author is not a vegan and she regularly eats meat. And so it just goes into a lot of tricky territory that I just found so fascinating to read about. What was also interesting was that outside of the debate, the author found the philosophy professor to be very nice and courteous and even charming to her. He never acted like he was disgusted by her disabilities or pitied her or anything like that. He was very much willing to help her get around the campus or try to find accessibility in the hotels that they booked her for the debate. It's very easy to see someone who has the opposite viewpoint as you as an evil monster. So it's really interesting for her to wrestle with that dynamic of someone who was perfectly likable and nice to her, and yet at the same time holds such radically different beliefs about her right to live. So the entire essay was super interesting, and again, it's online if you would like to read it for yourself. There was another story that I really like called The Isolation of Being Deaf in Prison, and this one was written by another person who was basically just typing down verbatim what a deaf prisoner was telling them. We already know that being in prison in the US is horrible, but being a deaf prisoner is a whole different set of challenges because you already have so many limited resources in the outside world, and then in prison, like just to be exposed to that kind of violence and lack of empathy or care or funds to help you out to navigate around prison. This whole book was just very rich in content. So I would totally recommend it to anyone, whether you are disabled or not. I mean, we're all gonna be disabled eventually. That's what I've realized. The next book that I read is Chlorine. This is a literary coming of age narrative. It is technically a horror, but it doesn't really go too deep into the horror aspects until like later on in the very end with some very slight body horror, just a little bit. Honestly, I kind of wish it went a lot more, just so that it would have given me some kind of more visceral reaction. It's basically about this Asian girl who is a swimmer, and she's so passionate about being the best swimmer ever, and she's never felt like she has really fit in with the rest of the humans, and she is so convinced that she is a mermaid, and eventually she will return to the ocean where she's meant to be because she doesn't actually belong in her family or in her friends or even in her swim team. It gets to a point where she feels like she has already transcended human concerns and priorities because she knows, I'm just a mermaid. I got bigger problems and I got bigger fish to fry, literally, back in the ocean with all my fish buddies. It kind of becomes like this insatiable need for her to be in the water, and eventually she feels like she has to do anything possible for her to be free. I think the way that she viewed herself and her otherness is probably more of like a parallel to her queer Asian identity. The word that I would use to describe the writing would be raw, because from the moment that you start reading this book, she just has such like a visceral voice, and I think it helps set the tone for being kind of like unsettling and disturbing. There is some sapphic elements to it, so we love that for the girlies over here. And there is some gore. Personally, I wish there was more. If you were an angsty Asian queer girl, maybe you could find some solidarity with this character. For me personally, I didn't even know I was gay until like I was an older adult, and I don't know how to swim, so I can't be part of this convo, but I'm glad for this girly who really knows herself so deeply already. Then the next book that I read is Your Blood, My Bones. This is a horror romance. I was especially into this because it's so character driven, and I love stories like that. So basically there's three central characters that we follow. One of them is the main girl who just inherited this farmhouse from her dead parents, and she plans on burning it to the ground because you know how the girlies be with the mommy and daddy issues. But while she's making her final lap, ready to burn it to smithereens, she finds a boy that was actually locked in the basement the entire time. And this boy was someone who had been a childhood friend of hers. All this time he's been strung up in chains and left for dead, and it turns out that he has suffered hundreds of ritualistic deaths. He is semi-immortal, so he has been trapped in the cycle of these painful deaths and even more painful rebirths. And there's no way to stop the cycle unless he ends the bloodline of the main girl's family. So that's why this book is so juicy, because they technically have to work together, because now that her parents are dead, the spells that were protecting the property are no longer working. So now there's all these ancient forces that are trying to come in and fuck shit up, so they gotta work together to try to take care of that situation. But it's kind of awkward because the guy theoretically should be trying to kill the girl so that he can be free, and the main girl has all this baggage because, you know, they have some history together. And the third guy, who we actually don't get a viewpoint, he was one of the childhood friends. It used to be the three of them in the good old days before shit hit the fan. It definitely gives dark Peter Pan vibes because it takes this idea of the nostalgia of childhood and being young and not knowing any better, and the brutal reality of waking the fuck up and trying to figure out what to do with that. I enjoy the writing style and how descriptive it was. I felt like the author has a very strong sense of voice. The prose is very lush and dark, so it was definitely a vibe. And then the 10th book that I have read recently is Funny Story, which is a romance contemporary book about a woman who was engaged to her fiance until her fiance realized that he has been in love with his childhood friend. So he leaves her for the friend. The main girl is obviously in shambles, and she ends up becoming roommates with that childhood best friend's ex, because that girlie was also dating someone and he also got dumped. And so now the main girl and the other guy that got dumped are gonna be living together. So they kind of did like a switcheroo over there. It's like possibly the worst double date that you could be on. But in a way, there's solidarity with licking your wounds together because he is the only other person that could understand where she's coming from. So this guy is, at least from my first impression of him, I thought he was gonna be like a loser stoner guy because he was obviously quite upset with, you know, being broken up with, and he was just coping with it by smoking all the time. And I'm like, finally, a loser stoner in an Emily Henry book so that I can see proper representation for myself. He's supposed to contrast how the main girl is much more buttoned up and put together because he's kind of like scruffy and more chaotic. I pictured him to be like Nick from New Girl. However, as I read more, he eventually morphed into the typical Emily Henry love interest, who is, at the end of the day, a very charismatic man who is emotionally intelligent and will pine for the main girl and give a very inspirational speech when it's time to grovel for the true love that he's meant to have. With every Emily Henry story, we're getting the same flavor with slightly different characters, but they still kind of feel like the same characters. The first time I'm charmed by it, but then the fifth time I'm like, okay, I get the formula and maybe I want something different. But I can understand people who want the same thing and know what they're signing up for, and that's why they keep on picking up every Emily Henry book. I actually have a friend who says that she feels that every time she reads a new book, Emily just gets better with each time that she writes it. Whereas I feel like the first book that I read from her was People We Meet on Vacation. Absolutely loved it. But the more that I read her other books and I see the same formula, the more they become generic to me because it's not something different than what I'm used to before. But I don't know why I have these double standards when it comes to her, but not Ali Hazelwood. Maybe I'm just more attracted to the guys in Ali Hazelwood books, and so I'm able to overlook it. But it's still harmless fun, and I liked the plot for this one with the switcheroo aspect. So I think when I was kind of going through like an audiobook slump, this was a fun little pick-me-up. So I definitely didn't have any regrets reading the book. I think I'm just becoming too aware of the formula that she always does. I mean, it obviously works out for her. I would be very curious if she tries anything different. However, I will be tuning in for the People We Meet on Vacation movie because they cast my man Tom Blythe as the main guy in that book. So that's my favorite book and my favorite man all in one. So I would definitely be tuning in because I know he's gonna give acting, he's gonna emote the same way that he did in Ballet of Songbirds and Snakes. So I will be seated, and you know what, good for Emily for having every single book be in the process of being adapted. I actually do think, despite me being kind of like meh about a couple of her books, I would still enjoy them as a movie compared to the other romance movies that we have out here right now. So that is pretty much my wrap up of 10 books I read recently. I hope you found a book in this wrap up that might be interesting for you to check out, and I will see you next time for the next book chat. Bye! You can tell 'em I'm fine.